yet fully alive as he had been to Josephine's charm throughout these 4 months, April to August, when he was entirely faithful to her, with the exception of a trivial lapse in the case of Mademoiselle Guilbeault. The idea of the divorce came back to him on his return, and no doubt had a good deal to do with his journey to Erfurt. He took Talleyrand with him, with instruction to give Alexander a hint that he was disposed to share his throne with one of the Grand Duchesses. But Talleyrand, instead of forwarding his master's interests, unblushingly betrayed him, suggesting to the Tsar the means by which to evade Napoleon's requests, pointing out the way to a fresh coalition against France, and laying the train for the War of 1809. After the meeting at Erfurt, Napoleon set out in all haste for Paris and the Spanish frontier, trusting to Alexander's ambiguities and half-promises. He thought the Russian marriage might be accomplished as soon as he had put down the Spanish revolt. It proved a formidable insurrection. The 2 months he had counted upon to restore order prolonged themselves into 3, which brought him only barren victories, discounted by plots against him among his own kinsfolk in Paris. The attitude of Austria, who was once more arming herself for the fray, the crusade of revolt preached by the archdukes to the German populace, and the successful attempts of the secret societies to fan the flames of the Holy War. At last he started at full speed for Benevent, spurring his tired horses from stage to stage, and riding as indefatigably as one of his own pages, after a sojourn of barely 3 months in Paris, during which he unmasked a traitor or two, put his own affairs in order, organized an army, and dispatched it to the Danube. He set out to meet the Austrian attack, the Archduke Charles having invaded the territory of the Confederation, when at last he drew rein at Schönbrunn, after a breathless course of nearly 17 months, and allowed himself to reflect calmly. The imperative necessity of the divorce became clear to him. It was not only that the question of the succession had become a pressing one, though the birth of his son would at least have put an end to the dark intrigues of the Murat. He further felt the importance of leaving some representative of himself in Paris, round whom his friends might rally in such an event as the English invasion or a legitimist rising. Josephine was not with him to work upon his senses by the remembrance of youthful passion, to touch his heart with the thought of a sweet companionship, or to alarm his imagination with superstitious fears of a future from which the influences of her star should be withdrawn. Another woman, more timid and yielding, and no less amiable, younger and lovelier than Josephine, even as he had first known her, had not only realized his dreams of gentle and discreet affection, but of paternity. The child she was about to bear was unquestionably his own. No such doubts as had crossed his mind as in the case of Eleanor were possible here. He knew how complete had been her self-surrender at Warsaw. He knew every detail of the secluded life she had led for 2 years past. He himself had prepared her prison at Schönbrunn, and was well assured of its security. He would hesitate no longer. The struggle that had disturbed his peace and wrung his heart for 2 long years was at an end. Those days and nights of doubt and anguish in which he had revolved every possible alternative his fertile brain could suggest had taught him the necessity of the sacrifice. Such expedients as the adoption of a natural son of his own, a simulation of pregnancy on the part of Josephine, the settlement of the succession on another of Hortense's children, had all been duly weighed and dismissed. There was, in truth, but one course by which the consolidation and stability of the empire could be assured, and this he had come to recognize as the one clearly marked out for him. Anxious to save himself and Josephine useless emotion, and to secure himself against further weakness and hesitation, he sent orders from Schönbrunn to the architect at Fontainebleau that the communication between the Empress's apartments and his own should be closed. And when Josephine arrived to join him there late for the first time in her life, she found him closeted with his ministers, a door locked against her. He allowed no opportunity for private conference and explanations. She never saw him, but in the presence of others, hints and suggestions were conveyed by means of intermediaries, and the situation was discussed. With the few who were fully in the Emperor's confidence, he felt the need of some intervention from a third person in the final struggle. And after invoking the help of Hortense, who declined the act, he summoned Eugène from Italy. As soon as it was known that the viceroy had started for Paris, Napoleon felt that the supreme moment could no longer be delayed, and he arranged for a private interview in which he announced his resolution to the Empress. She had expected his decision not only since 1807, but for many years. And now the blow had fallen, which all her skill had been powerless to avert, the dread of which had poisoned all her married life. She was now face to face with the terror that had threatened her after Bonaparte's return from Egypt, which had tormented her afresh when he became consul, when he was proclaimed emperor. At every epoch of her life, when fortune seemed to be heaping new gifts upon her, and this time she felt herself powerless. There was no remedy, no way of escape. She fell back upon swoons and tears, but rather as expedients by which something might be done to improve her position than with any hope of melting the emperor. She demanded a settlement for her son, definite promises and documents. For herself, she first stipulated that she should not be compelled to quit Paris, then that her debts should be paid, then that she should be allowed to retain the rank and privileges of empress, and finally that she should have plenty of money. Everything she asked was promptly granted. The Élysée was assigned her for her town residence, Malmaison for her country house, Navarre for her hunting box. An income of 3,000,000 francs was settled upon her. Her household was arranged on the same scale as before. She retained the title armorial bearing, guard, escort, and all the external tokens of sovereignty, occupying a place in the state so strange and unique in modern history that we must turn to Rome or Byzantium for its parallel. But money, palaces, titles were as nothing to Napoleon. He gave her the higher tribute of his tears. The first days of the separation he spent at Trianon, vainly attempting to forget his sorrow in the excitement of play. He was haunted by a feverish anxiety concerning his wife, and the road to Malmaison was enlivened by constant relays of pages, equerries, chamberlains, and state officials galloping backwards and forwards in hot haste to bring him the latest bulletins. He dispatched letter after letter with all the assiduity of an uneasy lover, sent daily visitors to observe and report upon her state, and eagerly devoured every detail of her life and surroundings. No deference, no attention, no graceful act of recognition seemed adequate to express his contrition. He implored her to summon all her resolution to her aid, to accept the inevitable, to make the best of her new position, and as far as possible to spare him the misery of knowing her unhappy by his act. When, however, he visited her himself at Malmaison, he never embraced her, nor did he ever enter her private apartments, for he wished it to be evident both to Josephine and to the world that all was over between them. Such conduct was yet another token of his delicate consideration for her. None, he resolved, should have any grounds for the suspicion that his wife of yesterday might become his mistress of tomorrow, or it may be that he was not sure even now of his own self-control. And if we admit this view of the case, it bears witness to something more vital than his respect for Josephine, to that fervent and lasting love of 13 years, which, surviving the loss of youth and beauty, had proved itself, in spite of momentary infidelities, one of the most blind and imperious passions ever inspired by woman. Chapter 12. Marie-Louise. Hitherto, Napoleon had looked upon every woman he had encountered as his inferior. The social prestige with which his fancy had invested Josephine at their first meeting ceased to dazzle him after 1806, when the great ladies of the old regime, Montmorencys, Montmars, and Lavals, began to frequent his court. He recognized the true position of the Beauharnais, and acquired a more exact knowledge of social distinctions. None of his mistresses had been women of exalted rank or fashion. He had never been seriously attracted by any such, or if he had soon wearied of them and abandoned his pursuit. At the height from which he now surveyed the world, his vanity would have found little satisfaction in any such conquest in France. The woman who should satisfy his ambition must be of a sphere as lofty as his own, the daughter of an imperial race. This dream, too, was to be realized. The Emperor of Austria formerly craved an alliance and offered him his eldest daughter, Marie-Louise, in marriage. This was no spurious entry into the Faubourg Saint-Germain, as in Josephine's case. It meant enrollment among a race of kings, kinship with a stock unsurpassed in antiquity and historic splendor, the dynasty of Bourbon and Habsburg. This was the final step in his ascent, raising him, in his own judgment at least, to the level of his predecessors on the throne he had conquered, and even giving him the right to speak of them by titles that would establish a sort of relationship between them and him. He would be justified in speaking of Louis XVI as my uncle, of Marie-Louise as my aunt, for his future wife was niece to the late King and Queen of France, both by her father and her mother. Henceforth, in addressing kings and emperors, he would no longer be reduced to the fraternal formula conventionally used by one sovereign to another. He would really be son-in-law or grandson, cousin, or brother-in-law to his peers. The Napoleonic system he had established in the West and interwoven with the ancient dynasties by the marriages of Eugene, Stephanie, and Jerome would now, by his own marriage, be as closely allied to the Austrian rulers as the Bourbon family had been. His dynasty would lose the improvised appearance that was now its chief source of danger and acquire the royal quarterings, which would qualify its revolutionary origin, together with the family attachments which Napoleon considered the only solid and lasting links in the chain of policy. The marriage satisfied his ambition at every point, but would his spirit of domination brook the pretensions of a woman of such haughty lineage and supreme rank? Would not birth and instinct alike have taught her her own importance, given her an overweening love of power and prominence, and imbued her with that sense of infallibility, the attribute of princes born in the purple, which raises them in their own estimation above their fellow mortals? By a strangely fortunate combination of circumstances, the ground seemed to have been specially prepared for him. The young girl destined to be his wife had been trained in the belief that her father's will must be her own in all things. She knew that her future would be subordinated to the interests of her house, that her person would form an item in some treaty, and she had been so educated as to ensure her acceptance of any husband imposed on her by political exigencies without repugnance. Such was the part for which she had been trained from her earliest years. She had been taught many languages: German, English, Turkish, Bohemian, Spanish, Italian, French, and even Latin, for it was impossible to say where her lot might be cast. But the richer her vocabulary, the more extensive her machinery for expressing ideas. The fewer ideas she had to express, a wise provision both of nature and of her teachers. Much care had been bestowed on accomplishments such as music and drawing, which afford dignified and suitable occupations for idle princesses wherever fate may place them. She had been instructed in the elements of religious knowledge and trained to a minute observance of outward forms, but all discussion of disputed points of dogma had been avoided, for the husband of the future might not improbably be a schismatic. Her moral training had been based mainly on a system of elaborate mystification. The archduchesses were kept in ignorance of such facts as duality of sex and nature, with an ingenuity only possible to casuists of the great Spanish school. Her teachers had safeguarded her innocence by refinements of prudery that verged on the obscene. The poultry yards of the palace were stocked with hens, among which no cocks were allowed to intrude. Hen canneries were only to be found in the cages, and only she-dogs were admitted to the archduchess's apartments. All the books, and such books, were expurgated by the aid of a pair of scissors. pages, lines, and even words were cut out bodily, the operators never apparently considering that the curiosity of archduchesses might be aroused by these mystical lacunae, a governess in Aya, and lastly, a headmistress successively held all speculation in check. The latter superintended the princess's surroundings, was present at her lessons, directed her amusements, had overlooked servants and teachers. She never left her charge day or night, the post being an important one and of some weight from a political point of view. Its occupant changed with the ministry. Marie Louise had 5 head governesses in 18 years, but her education was regulated by rules so strict and severe that its course was little affected by such mutations.